If we'd known then what we know now, we might never have set off. The crashes, the incessant punctures, the miles and miles of mud, the horrific accidents. 42,000 miles around the world on a motorcycle. You must be joking.
Let's go!
Calling the trip Mondo Enduro, our grandiose scheme was to establish a record for motorcycling around the world using the longest possible land route in the shortest possible time. We filmed the whole trip ourselves on a Hi8 camera and even an old Super 8 Cine camera. And day by day, mile by mile, we recorded what happened in our diary. My name's Austin Vince, and I teach maths at Mill Hill School in North London. The head brilliantly gave me a year's leave of absence, but I think he was just pleased to see the back of me. My older brother Gerald works at Bournemouth railway station, and a more implausible motorcycle adventurer would be hard to imagine.
I've always wanted to do it. I've been at work now 20 years, it's time for a bit of a break and hopefully a bit of a career change when I come back.
My friend Nick Stubley did engineering with me at college and was very much the Mr. Spock of Mondo Enduro. He now designs missile systems, and he'd be leaving his girlfriend behind to come with us. Clive Greenhow was at school with me. Soon to be grinding sprockets from Calais to the Caspian, he was currently grinding pepper in Pinner. The first headache was what bikes to take. We consulted long-distance bike guru Chris Scott, author of the Adventure Motorcycling Handbook. Hi.
Hi there.
We're looking for a chap called Chris Scott.
Yeah, that's me.
He confirmed what we'd already heard. We needed a big, beefy steed.
A 600cc bike will have a kind of a, like I say, enough power to keep you moving with all your baggage loaded up, but not be too heavy. That's all. That's my advice.
So this bike, it's the Yamaha XT 600.
600, yeah.
We did value Chris Scott's advice, but ultimately ignored it, because Gerald had a hunch.
All the people we've spoken to have poo-pooed the idea of taking a smaller bike, but the 350s are much better off-road than the bigger bikes. The bigger the bike, the less capable they are in the dirt.
Gerald has a fascination for minutiae, and he applied this to his choice of luggage.
I've opted for hard luggage because A, it's secure, it locks onto the bike, and B, it's 100% waterproof. You've got the brackets here, these bolt onto the frame of the bike, there, and then you've got the pannier, it's like a suitcase, and that clips on, slots on there like that, and it's locked on. The soft luggage people, Austin has made up some leather panniers, and Clive is taking 2 rucksacks, which is just going to hang over the back seat.
Bill Penty was another university friend who, like me, was now a teacher, but of Japanese, and like Nick, was leaving his fiancée behind.
I'm finishing my job in Shropshire, and I've been offered a job in South London for when I get back, so it seemed practically an ideal time to go, really.
Bill was at school with Mark Friend, who was not a teacher, but a financial mover and shaker in the city.
Best thing about going on this trip will be getting away from work. I've been cooped up in an office for the last 9 years, and I can't wait to get outside and get some fresh air inside me.
The night before we left, this Easy Rider was having his packing supervised by his mother.
Right, Clive.
There we have my chat.
How are you doing
Oh, no, not too bad, just finishing off the last bits and pieces before I go.
Can I see what you've got? Right. Have you got enough underclothes there?
Yes, Mum, I've got enough.
Is everything
I've got
clean?
plenty of those.
Clive, every 2 weeks, on the day, you have to phone me, right? Because if you don't, I shall be worrying my head off.
All right,
so
Mum,
please,
okay.
don't forget.
I won't forget.
The next morning, a big crowd of friends and family saw us off from my school at Mill Hill. Well, the first 100 miles were Easy Rider, but not easy enough to prevent us losing track of each other on the way to Dover.
Well, here's Dover. There's the boat that's taking us to France. No turning back now.
I wish there was, Phil, but it's an undeniable sort of anticipation and excitement about this whole thing. I just can't believe it. 2.5 years of planning. It's finally happening.
I know. I think it's really exciting. We've already had a couple of things go wrong on the way down. It took us hours to get from London.
We got lost in London, got separated. Brilliant, genius. Let's hope that doesn't happen in wherever, Russia or something.
The channel was stormy, and we were all seasick. This wasn't really the start we wanted for a year of non-stop travelling. We headed straight for Paris, but then stuck to the back road. It was fantastic to finally be on the way, but a strange feeling to know that we'd have to keep riding every day for a year before we finally got back to London. We were always only too happy to take a break and indulge in a roadside brew. These first few days saw how hopelessly unprepared we were for a daily routine of long-distance riding. We were already totally exhausted. We were heading for the heel of Italy, 1,000 miles away. Although the Autostrada found the 350s slightly underpowered, we knew they'd come good on the mountain roads that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Clive was proving himself quite the boy racer and court jester of Mondo Enduro. But on the road to Pisa, he was still thinking of his family. So he made sure he found time to send a reassuring postcard home to his mum. We were almost starting to get complacent, when just south of Rome, Gerald had a spectacular wipeout that smashed up his cherished hard luggage. He'd spent hours in his Bournemouth garage designing and building the brackets that supported his panniers, and now they were virtually destroyed.
Well, I think it was just too much weight for the bracket to bear. When we were pulling it out, it came off away, like came and snapped like that, and there it is, broken in half.
Perhaps having some soft luggage. A few rucksacks over there, Gerald. What do you think about that? Then you'd never really have that problem, would you?
Well, right, as far as I'm concerned, rucksacks are the last resort.
Gerald's reputation as a genius at repairs in the field remained intact, and we wound our way through the Apennine Mountains down to Bari, where we hoped to find a ferry to take us over to northern Greece. We still had no idea how we were going to get from Turkey into the Caucasus, but decided to put that decision off till later and set off across beautiful northern Greece. We developed a routine of rough camping and a rigorously applied policy of self-catering. With no sponsorship or financial help of any kind, we ate fruit, vegetables and pasta, just so we could stay within our meagre budget. But even a fortnight into Mondo Enduro, team members who'd left girlfriends behind, like Mark, were possibly wondering if a year spent living with 6 other men was actually going to be that great.
We've been on the road for 10 days, and it seems like 6 months. Getting the miles done is a constant pressure, but it doesn't matter, because every day the scenery gets even more lovely.
Gerald, meanwhile, blossomed with every mile further from England, and instead of railway timetables, he could now obsess about fuel consumption performance.
Clive, who's been a bad boy, obviously racing ahead there, he's only got 58.91 to the gallon. What uses up the petrol is the acceleration, and Clive is obviously getting away from the lights and the road junctions a bit quicker than the rest of us.
Keeping an eye on the money was a duty we all shared. Each of us was carrying $2,500 in small bills, which currently was bulging out of every pocket. Soon to leave Europe, we wanted this money stashed away, so we no longer had to carry it about our person. All set for the next leg, but a few miles from the Turkish border, I suddenly discovered I'd brought the registration document for my car instead of my bike.
Austin, what's the problem?
Well, I'm having to take my number plate off here, Nick, not because it's broken, but for another, a bit more serious reason.
And why is that? Why is that? It looks perfectly fine to me.
Well, it's a lovely number plate, and that's the real one. Crescent Motorcycles, Bournemouth there. But I unfortunately forgot the V5, which is the ownership document, which shows that I own this motorcycle. This is the V5 for my car. I left the one for my bike in my stuff somewhere in London. I don't know where it is. Just to make a few details a bit more correct, though, the engine numbers and all that sort of stuff on here don't match up with the real ones. So I'm just going to cross these out with the biro. So everyone had to wait, whilst the car number plate was couriered over from London.
Well, if that doesn't get us through the Turkish border guards, I don't know what will. So can we just see the new number plate now?
There he is, going up.
Just censor the critical bits out there.
The critical parts, and here he is. And but we haven't got a drill, so we need to show a bit more Mondo Enduro ingenuity. Well, if you get your mole grips and stick a nail in, which we actually, would you believe, we've brought nails all the way from England, and here we are getting the the nail heated up. It occurred to me just now, when I was desperate to get hold of a drill, that we can actually pierce a hole here with the hot nail technique, as I think it's known in the trade. With Midnight Express fresh in my mind, I had visions of 20 years in a Turkish dungeon. Miraculously, my schoolboy forgeries satisfied the customs officials, so it was destination Istanbul.
Well, here we are in Istanbul, having made it in one piece, which is quite remarkable. Istanbul, it's a city which you all know very well, very beautiful, but the most stunning thing for us has been the traffic. We crossed into Turkey yesterday. The roads were empty, but the closer we got to this ancient capital, the thicker the traffic got, and the crazier it became, really, until the past 2 miles have been the hardest 2 miles of the 2,500 we've done so far.
Once out of Istanbul, traffic was the least of our problems. The only gas station for 200 miles was burnt out and deserted. Then the chains of 2 of the bikes snapped, but Gerald managed to repair them using only a centre punch, a rock and some pliers. The richly potholed country roads spawned a blizzard of punctures, each of which had to be painstakingly repaired on the edge of the highway.
The first puncture, well, that was quite good fun. We could use all our new kit. The second and third, well, that was good practice for the days ahead. This is our 7th, and to be frank, it's the right pain in the arse. Turkey was supposed to be good fun. Lots of sunshine, nice food, bit of racky, that kind of thing. We thought it was going to be a roll. Hasn't turned out like that. We thought all our problems were going to start in the former Soviet Union. We were wrong.
The tyre here looks pretty irreparable. We put a repair on, but even the repair's ripped to shreds.
This is all stemmed from the pothole back in Ankara, believe it or not. City roads and a complete hell.
God, I don't know. I think it's the end of Mondo Enduro for me. I just had enough of all this shit. Just can't take it anymore.
Mark soon cheered up. But although we eventually got going, The problem of our puncture repairs peeling off continued to haunt us. But we were now getting to the point where we had to make a decision about our route out of Turkey so we could get to Kazakhstan.
We could get to the border, see if it's open.
Which one's that? Which is the shortest
This
one?
one here, let it go into Armenia, let it in again.
Yeah.
And if it's not open, then we just trundle up here and then go this
Get
way.
through Georgia.
That's the easiest. That's the thing to do, isn't it? Surely.
Yeah.
Okay, Nick, what's the summary then?
Okay, we're going to try the Armenian border. If it's open, if it's not, we're going to have to go through Georgia, and that's it.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, here we are at the Turkish-Armenia border, and it seems to be totally deserted and closed. It's kind of strange and spooky, really, because we've been through several military checkpoints today, and they've just waved us on through. Austin has just gone to have a look around, see if he can find anything else, see if anyone's around. Austin,
This is mad. The whole place is like, there's no one here or anything. It's like, I went to some buildings over there, I thought it looked like an office sort of thing. But it's like, what's this?
Chat, stop filming.
We were arrested and locked up in the barracks. But in the morning, the captain realised we weren't a threat and he invited us to a feast. The feast itself was looking distinctly apprehensive. The captain and his young daughter couldn't have been more hospitable. She was keen to practice her English and left a message in our logbook. For the feast, things had gone from bad to worse. And whilst the captain explained that we'd strayed into Turkey's most heavily restricted military area, lunch was being prepared before our very eyes. And delicious it was too. So, denied entry into Armenia, we rode north to the Black Sea coast, heading for Georgia. As the time came to finally enter the former Soviet Union, our anxiety increased.
Whenever you're ready, I'll follow you in.
However, we'd been misinformed about what a dangerous and lawless country Georgia had become. We rode through without batting an eyelid. In fact, the rugged countryside of Georgia was outstandingly beautiful, and we were spoilt for choice of rough campsites in the gorgeous Caucasus Mountains. And everyone we met in Georgia insisted we came to stay.
We're now in the Georgian Republic here with our host and his father, who was in the Great Patriotic War in the 40s, and he's going to tell us a bit about his medals, I believe.
ვიბრძოდი ისე როგორც საჭირო იყო სამშობლოსათვის.
Ему уже 82 года. Работает, пока еще трудоспособен, и дай бог, чтоб жили еще долго.
At Baku, in Azerbaijan, we found a ferry to take us across the Caspian Sea to the newly independent Central Asian Republic of Turkmenistan. We were heading for Bukhara, an ancient city on the old Silk Route that led from China to the west. But first, we had 1,000 miles of desert to cross. Before the Mongol invasion, Bukhara had been a centre of learning, boasting 360 mosques and a huge library. This oasis still serves a welcome meal of lakhman, a noodle dish traditionally served outdoors.
The great Kalyan minaret in Bukhara, which was the only thing in the whole of Bukhara to be spared the havoc, destruction of the Mongol hordes when Genghis Khan swept so decisively and conclusively through here about 1200. He was perhaps in awe of its beauty and splendour, which is not to be denied. But perhaps he was also very aware of its punitive aspects, because death by ejaculation, or throwing people off the top until they die, was a common form of killing thieves and faithless wives. No faithless husbands, mind you.
Now you can see the championship between Bukhara and England. Chess championship. Bishop goes, okay? And what will be the reaction of the partner from Bukhara. So he goes with a little figure.
Sadly, Chaz wasn't able to resist the Mongol hordes either. Our next stop on the old Silk Road was Samarkand, ancient capital of Tamerlane the Great, who is now the national hero of Uzbekistan. One of the oldest cities in the world, Samarkand has been continually inhabited for at least 10,000 years. Tamerlane is estimated to have caused the deaths of 17 million people, but he always spared the best craftsmen. To Samarkand were sent Asia's finest architects, masons, glaziers, and tile makers. And so out of the desert sands rose the glittering capital of Islam's mightiest warrior king. After another 700 miles of arid countryside, we finally reached Kazakhstan. We were 6,000 miles from London and found ourselves camping only 20 miles from China. There were 7 of us taking it in turns to write the diary. So if it's Nick doing the entry, it must be Thursday.
We haven't even reached Russia yet, but after 6 weeks on the road, I must confess I'm missing Catherine. I think the other lads are missing their girlfriends too.
After 6 weeks and 6,000 miles, we'd had 23 punctures, 7 broken chains and 2 minor accidents. And Magadan didn't seem any closer. We were all absolutely exhausted. We certainly didn't feel like easy riders. But we had to press on across the empty miles of Kazakhstan. Often we didn't see a single other motorised vehicle all day. In between the cities, there were no petrol stations, so we had to buy fuel from mobile tankers parked at road junctions. We negotiated a price with a combination of our poor Russian and nanny hand signals. This particular transaction was brokered by the local Kazakh militiaman. Kazakhstan is vast, easily the size of Western Europe, yet 90% of it is steppe, featureless flat grassland. Ideal for grazing sheep, it's no surprise livestock outnumber people, despite millions of sheep being slaughtered by the Cossacks, or Kazakhs, rather than give them over to the Soviet collective farms.
Good morning, this is Gerald Vince for Mondo Enduro. We are 30 miles from the Chinese-Soviet border, and behind me you'll see a disused Soviet Air Force base.
The hangars were camouflaged with grass, so they couldn't be seen from the air, and heavily reinforced with concrete. And these are the massive old kind of car engines that it seems were attached to a huge wire that would literally drag open the massive concrete blast doors. The deserted airbase, which had once housed enough nuclear weapons to wipe out most of China, was a spooky place to spend the night. Another legacy of Soviet rule was the extremely high nuclear contamination from the hundreds of atomic bombs tested in the area.
Here we are, a few kilometres shy of Semipalatinsk, which, as I'm sure you all know, was until very recently the Soviet nuclear testing ground. And we're a little short of water, and we came across this lovely river in the North Kazakhstan steppe. And fear of residual radiation poisoning and other impurities led us to take out our cat-o' pocket filter, with which we can pump 1 litre per minute of pure water, pure, I'd like to say Swiss alpine water, for us fit to drink wherever we are. Yeah, one nice full jerry can.
So, apprehensive about what we'd find, we set off for the border and Russia proper. We psyched ourselves up for roads peppered with potholes and bundles of bureaucratic Russian red tape. But we weren't expecting even basic supplies to become unobtainable luxuries. Iskatim set the tone for the rest of Russia. An almost deserted high street, empty shops, but with an occasional glut of pickled garlic or Bulgarian padlocks. Small-time entrepreneurs sell any available produce in the street from the boots of their cars. But some Russians are forced to peddle potatoes and onions from just a bucket. In town after town, we were the centre of attention. Sometimes just a Westerner asleep was fascination itself. Often the bikes had praise heaped on them by locals, more used to a 1950s look.
Believe it or not, this is the M53 motorway from Novosibirsk to Irkutsk. It's in a dreadful condition. What do you think about it, Chaz?
Well, you're right, Joel, it is in a dreadful condition. There's potholes all over the place, there's dust on the road, and lorries just blow it up into your faces. It is very gruelling driving conditions.
Crash number 3 for me was a big one. I was overtaking one of these monster trucks, and in all the dust that gets thrown up, it's a bit of an act of faith. And the truck in front, there was in fact a second truck in front, was throwing up so much dust that as I cut back to the right-hand lane, I hit some boulders, and I ended up falling on the side of the, falling underneath the bike, really.
It turned out that Mark had badly sprained his ankle and found it almost impossible to kickstart the bike. The road penetrated the forests of Siberia, a name derived from the Mongolian for sleeping land. The trees stretched out for 1,000 miles in every direction. It's frozen to minus 60 degrees centigrade in the winter, but in the summer it's boiling hot and the forest teems with vicious mosquitoes and battalions of Russian red ants. Siberia is a place of extremes, and if the sun is beating down on you one day, you can bet it'll be thunderstorms the next. And this cycle of mad weather was starting to get at some of Mondo Enduro.
Oh.
How far is it to Irkutsk now?
It must be about
2 days, actually. At this rate.
Let's look at the map
Mind
thing.
you, at
Where's
this
the
rate,
map book, lads?
Could be three or more days.
Have you got the Russian map book? It's not going to get any worse than this. Just a bit of rain and
I've got to get to Alaska by end of June.
Is that when Catherine's coming over?
Yeah. No, we've got to get there in, a week or 2 weeks at the most. So.
From now?
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to do that, are we?
Well, I've got to get to.
Why don't you just ring her up? When we get to Irkutsk, ring her up and get her to change the flight.
Ring her up and cancel it. Well, there's Mark and Bill as well who are going to be in a similar situation.
There's a bit of a mutiny.
Well, it's not a mutiny.
Mutiny on Monday.
Carry on.
No,
yeah, but I mean, it's. But it'll be a shame if we'll be the first people to have done it, as far as we know.
Nick, Bill and Mark had all left Sweethearts behind, who they always intended to meet up with once we all got to Alaska. But we were behind schedule, and by the following morning they were thinking of leaving the trip early at Irkutsk. When we reached the city, Chaz swiftly located an interpreter who helped us get new sprockets machined and forged from scratch. But whilst 4 of us set about restoring the road-weary 350s, the other 3 had made their decision. What with the mud, dust, mosquitoes, injuries, but above all the slow going, they decided to call it a day.
So why are you packing it in now?
Well, it's a question of time more than anything else. We've run out of it. We've got to meet up with the girls in Alaska, and we've got to go now if we're going to meet them on time. So what we're hopefully going to do is load the bikes onto the Trans-Siberian Express, get over to Khabarovsk, hopefully get onto a plane over to Anchorage, and meet up with the girls on schedule. I mean, we'd love to carry on with you, but the roads have been bad enough as it is so far. And by all accounts, they just run out from here on in. There are no roads from here on in over to the Far East. So it's you guys who are going to need all the luck. And I wish you the best of it, really. And we'll see you when we see you.
So we were down to 4. Me, Gerald, Chaz and Clive. No sooner had we left Irkutsk than we reached Lake Baikal, the largest body of fresh water on the planet, up to a mile deep in places and home to many rare species of fish. Unfortunately, its shore is blighted by a colossal wood pulp mill which belches untreated smog from its trademark red and white smokestacks. Filming here is forbidden, but we got our lens as close as we dared. Back on the Siberian motorway, Clive raced ahead as usual, but we eventually caught up with him another disaster and a downpour later.
Total nightmare.
What's up?
The bearing is totally disintegrated. It's just some bits of ball bearings and
Oh, Jesus. Hang on a sec.
This is an absolute disaster.
This isn't in the plan, is it,
We
mate?
don't have any ball bearings. We're not carrying ball bearings, are we, at all?
So Clive went off to try and borrow a hammer from a nearby log cabin, but came back with something far better.
It's a new bearing near Mongolia. It goes on the axle, but we've got to try it in the wheel.
Show us that on the camera,
And
sort of
here's,
thing.
look,
Does it fit in?
here's the old one.
Yeah.
And I've just got this new one from this guy.
Hang on, it fits perfect, isn't it? I can't really see through the viewfinder type thing.
Well, it slides on. It's quite tight. It slides on, but what we need to check is to make sure that it fits in the actual wheel. This is stuff. You're not gonna. It's snug like a glove.
Result. Okay, let's.
They've got the same wheel. It's an 18-inch wheel, the same axle.
So it must be a standard size or something like that.
It must be standard. Oh, Austin, guess what? As well as giving us the bearing, the guy's just given me the bearing. He's just said, come back, and he's got vodka. He's gonna. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but he's going, vodka, come back, my house.
What, we're going to get large at his gaff?
We're going to drink vodka and sleeping.
And that place down there?
It's incredible, mate.
The Siberians are a people in contrast to where they live. Warm, friendly and hospitable. Our host, Sergei Galashnikov, insisted we stay and demolish several bottles of vodka with him and his ex-Navy comrades.
Спасибо for fixing my bike.
Clive accepted Sergei's bear hug, not realising our host was merely adjusting his false teeth. Soon we were getting the hang of the exposed intimacy of the log cabin, showing off our new lice-proof hairdos, gulag style, and being inducted into an impromptu international arm wrestling face-off.
Вот это по-русски пошло. О, вот это наше. Вот это Сибирь пошла, матушка.
Ну что, прям или как? Ну, конечно. Кого прям?
Не были хули?
Despite Clive's victory, Sergei and co. were still keen to party. The trickle of Siberian hospitality soon turned into a flood, and we were offered an irresistible slab of raw fish.
That's frozen fish. Here we have Siberian style. It's raw. Straight out the lake pipe.
Пошел ты, пизду. Зверек. Че, зверек?
After the cocktails and canapes of the night before, we staggered out next morning. We admired Sergei's chicks, whilst he cast a covetous eye over our capitalist motorcycles. Sergei told us that when the road ran out, there was a trail that led to Skоворino. So we set off across the tundra. But the tundra turned to bog. And the bog turned to swamp. We encountered stretches of track, but would then be beaten back by a flooded section. We alternated between dehydration in the heat wave and saturation in the rainstorms. Progress began to be measured in hundreds of meters.
I don't want to.
We were finally reduced to portage, that most hated of last resorts, where we'd man-pack our equipment, returning to the abandoned bikes to nurse them forward unloaded. One of the mysteries of Mondo Enduro unfolded when Gerald returned to collect his precious hard luggage. Somebody had taken it, yet we hadn't seen another human being for days. Shattered and dispirited, we took refuge from a looming thunderstorm and tried to take stock.
Well, thank heavens for the Trans-Siberian Railway. We're holed up here under this bridge, sheltering from the rain. It's taken us 2 days to do the last 15 miles. We're absolutely exhausted. The last 15 miles have taken their toll on the bikes. We've got to change the tyres over on the bikes for ones with better tread. There isn't any water here. We're just collecting in pots and pans the stuff that drips off the railway bridge. Then we are just boiling it up and making brews out of it. We're starving, hungry. I haven't eaten properly. Yesterday there wasn't enough time for it and everything. Worst of all, Gerald has gone down very badly with some kind of flu thing. He's very weak. We've got 3 days worth of food on us. There's a town coming up in about 15 miles. If we can get there in the next 3 days, we might be able to get some more supplies.
Morale is rock bottom. It's never been this bad before. When we looked at the maps back in England and saw there was a gap in the road, we never imagined we'd grind to a halt like this. The bikes are just too heavily laden.
We've got 400 miles left to do. If it carries on like this, I really don't see how we could possibly make it.
The following morning, we set off from our temporary shelter under the Trans-Siberian Railway Bridge. We still had 400 miles of swamp to slog through before the road began again. The rutted track we were following cut straight across country and right through the meanders of the Chernieva River. The relatively shallow water posed no obstacle to the heavy agricultural Siberian vehicles which used the track. But each time the river zigzagged, we had to spend hours recceing the shallowest spot to ford it with our bikes, unloading the luggage and nursing the bikes across. During one of these crossings, I lost patience and tried to make it over with my bike fully loaded. It toppled over and everything I possessed got completely soaked. I'd waterproofed the inside of my leather panniers so well that when the water got in, it couldn't get out again.
My address book here is all stuck together, and most of them have all run into each other. So Mum and Dad, if you ever see this, contact the TV station that this is being broadcast and try and find where I am at the moment, because I can't remember where you live.
10,000 miles and repeated soakings had finally rotted my trusty military boots, and so they were formally cremated on Chaz's fire.
Okay, 5cc.
A more serious casualty of the river was the engine of my bike, which had also got completely flooded with water. Using a syringe from the medical kit, we injected petrol into the cylinder and tried to blow the water out.
least we can get my fingers down here.
It worked after a fashion, although one of the Siberian locals, well used to the problem, later told us that a far simpler way of doing it is just to tow a flooded bike and jumpstart it. As soon as the bike had dried out, it was time to give it another soaking in the Chernieva River. But by now, we'd realised that we couldn't go on like this. In fact, we couldn't go on at all, as the bikes were falling apart beneath us. Finally, we limped into the Kisly Kulch gold mining collective maintenance depot for some much-needed repairs. Because of its inaccessibility and the severity of the winters, the workers have to be capable of repairing everything at the gold mine. Siberians take a pride in their self-sufficiency, and in one of the workshops, they kindly turned us out a full set of sprockets on their lathes. And fed us in their canteen, pasta and pork fat, and half a cucumber. So, we left Kisly Kulch gold mine on our now healthy bikes. We'd also made a big decision. There was no way we'd be able to ride the 100 miles to Skоворodino unless we rode the Trans-Siberian Railway. Looking back on it, we were stupid not to have used the railway before. Apart from flying, it really is the only route across this part of Siberia. That's because of the extremes of temperature, permafrost in the winter, and as we'd experienced, deep mud in the summer. The trains keep going all year round. The Trans-Siberian Railway provides the world's longest continuous train journey, 5,700 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok. To be honest, having already ridden over 10,000 miles on our motorbikes, even travelling in a goods wagon counted as luxury. We were only too happy to take it easy for a change. Given that everything and everyone has to travel around by rail in this part of Siberia, there's still a distinct hierarchy of journeys. Under railwayman Gerald's expert tuition, we were able to work out that lumber moves slower than crude oil, which moves slower than local passengers, who moves slower than express passengers. As mixed freight, we move slowest of all, and sometimes not at all. It took us 2 nights and a day to travel the 100 miles to Skоворodino. Back on our bikes once more, we made quick time on good roads up to our next mode of Siberian transport, the boats which used the extensive river system to cross country. Our longest journey was up the Lena River on barge number M27, crewed by Vladimir and his wife Marina. The Lena River starts near the Mongolian border at Lake Baikal and winds 2,000 miles north to the Arctic Ocean. In the winter, it freezes to a depth of several meters and provides a far more reliable route for even the heaviest lorries than the roads. Apart from us, the only other cargo on barge M27 was 50,000 litres of vodka and a consignment of Cuban flip-flops. We were by now so far north that in the summer, even at midnight, it never gets dark. For 5 days, we chugged our way slowly down the Lena River. And then even more slowly up the Aldan River towards Khandagar, where the road began again. We got used to the entirely different rhythms of life on board a boat. We left the wood chopping for the kitchen stove to the far more able-bodied Siberians. But once they got the stove going, we cooked the crew a meal of fish which we caught over the side. No prizes for guessing what Vladimir and Marina's little son, Aloysia, wants to be when he grows up. And yes, that is the lifeboat that he's using for his toys. We finally reached Khandigar to start on the last leg of our journey in Russia, to Magadan, and hopefully a flight to Alaska. A monster crane unloaded the bikes, making the beasts that we had struggled with all these miles seem as light as feathers. On the banks of the Aldan River, Gerald at last got his cracked hard luggage frame properly repaired. The only thing was, he didn't have any hard luggage to put on it. And after our delicious days of idleness on the ferry, it was back on the bikes for a final body-shaking ride to the Pacific Ocean via the Road of Bones. 7 of us had set off from Mill Hill in May on our round-the-world epic. At the beginning of August, 111 days later, the uneasy riders of Mondo Enduro made it into Magadan in eastern Siberia. Just 4 of us had made it the 12,000 miles so far. We still had North and South America and Africa to get through. It would be many thousands of miles and many dramas before we were once again back in England. By the time we flew from Magadan in Siberia, 7 of us who started out were down to just 4. In North America, the roads were transformed, but we were still slaves to our low-budget ethos of rough camping. That's Chaz there, tending the fire. My brother Gerald scrubbing the saucepan. Clive still stuffing his face as usual. And that's me, Austin, smartening myself up. The smooth tarmac of the Pacific Coast Highway was a joy to ride after the dirt tracks of Siberia. But our tribulations weren't over. In Vancouver, Gerald had an announcement to make in his own inimitable style.
Right then, what's the news?
Well, that's it, Austin. We're here at Vancouver, BC, and I'm out of cash. Can't go any further on the trip.
Oh.
Luckily, though, my mate Neil, who works here, lives here, has given me a job so that I can save up enough money to fly home. So I'll be home in a month or 2, I should think. See you back in England.
Gerald has finally run out of money. Despite selling his house to finance Mondo Enduro, he was always underfunded. As the founding father and elder statesman of our trip, and after all we went through in Siberia, it seems quite unfair for me, Clive and Chaz to leave him here like this. It's the worst news for Mondo Enduro so far. Now, down to only 3, we rode south to San Francisco. After spending months simply surviving in Russia, it was great to just enjoy this fabulous city. After San Francisco, it was another 500 easy miles to Los Angeles. If ever we were going to feel like easy riders, it was in California. We made such good time on the freeways that we could break our itinerary and catch a wave. Athletic Clive swiftly emerged as our top surfer duo. And finally, across the border into Mexico. In America, everyone warned us to be on our guard in Mexico. Fortunately, we found quite the reverse. In fact, it was becoming a rule of thumb on Mondo Enduro that the poorer a society, the more prone to unconditional acts of generosity the people became. Just outside Acapulco, we humbly knocked on a farmer's wicker gate and asked to share the porch with his livestock. After lengthy consultations with his wife, Francisco kindly agreed to let us stay. We laid out the bedding and set about our routine chores. Chaz made the daily entry in the diary in front of a curious spectator. However, the other farmyard fowl were indifferent to Clive's routine check for ants in his pants. To celebrate the completion of 21,000 miles, halfway to our round-the-world record, Chaz treated himself to an orange glitter helmet. But we soon realised that we weren't the only people in Mexico on a two-wheeled mission. We came across a bizarre feature of the Mexican roads. This was the third carcass which had been left for the vultures to dispose of in their own time. We were now deep into the steamy tropical zone. The weather ran the full gamut. Sometimes it was hot and wet. Sometimes it was hot and dry. A horrendous grinding noise warned me of the problem which had hit Clive in Siberia. The bearings on my front wheel had given out. But I'd only been there a minute when, materializing out of nowhere, came Jorge and his nameless friend on a Honda 175. The two of them set off with Chaz to get a replacement bearing.
We're here on the Mexican-Guatemalan border, and this is really the first bit of drama for a long time. Front wheel bearing disintegrated. It's bound to happen eventually.
Within half an hour, they were back, and we put the new bearing in on the spot. Sadly, unlike Siberia, Jorge had neither vodka nor even tequila to ply us with, and certainly no raw fish. After Guatemala, we went straight through Honduras, but found time outside San Salvador to visit an extinct volcano crater. It was now flooded and contained El Lago Cotopeque. El Salvador's rich and famous all owned beachside villas here, but last night we camped out in the trees on the far bank. The lake was typical of the wonderful scenery of Latin America, whilst the border posts were straight out of the 1950s.
South America, this way!
Once over the Panama Canal and into South America, all money changing was done strictly away from the banks. This was on a small ferry called the Caribe on the Magdalena River. As usual, time was at a premium, and even the half hour on the ferry was a chance to change the rear brake disc. Nothing ever seemed to be straightforward for us, and the bolts had to be drilled out and ripped free with a stud extractor which we'd acquired in El Salvador. As we went under the bridge, it became clear that all work on it had been abandoned, and the lorry drivers told us the contractors had been scared away by bandits. Like us, the lorry drivers used the time to do their ongoing maintenance. Just as the Americans had warned us about Mexico, the Mexicans had warned us about the guerrillas and rebels in Colombia. But although the aborted construction work was testimony to their presence, we had no qualms about sleeping rough. Bogotá, the capital of Colombia, was a well-ordered and modern city, and not a hive of drug traffic and gun running as we'd expected. We were trying to concentrate for the filming of a news bulletin, but were distracted by Clarissa, the production assistant. She, in turn, was struck by Chaz's excellent command of Spanish. The Andes Mountains start in Colombia, and the further south we went, the higher we climbed, across steep gorges and into Ecuador. We came to know the mountain roads like the back of our hands.
Well, as you can see, today we're in Quito and we're on our way to Bucay.
In Trujillo, in northern Peru, we were the guests of Barbara Pascoe, an old friend from Harrow. We were able to do some much-needed repairs to the bikes. A cracked chain, amongst other things. And we restored our road-weary leathers to their supple best, with the aid of some shoe polish we brought all the way from England. We also got some real sleep at last, and some tender loving care from the little spaniels, Lola and Mr. James. In Trujillo, it was election time, and the marching bands were out. And as so often in South America, so were the military. The local beauty queen was paraded alongside the dour candidates, but our eye was drawn to the plague of beetles on the streets. Until very recently, huge assembly lines in Mexico and Brazil churned out these people wagons long after production had ceased in Europe, and they were everywhere. Within 100 miles of Trujillo, the lush Andean rainforest had given way to the arid northern reaches of the Atacama Desert. The Pan American Highway, straight as an arrow, is the only evidence of human agency in this, the driest place on Earth. The Atacama stretched for 3,000 miles before us, and although the heat tasted man and machine almost to the limit, we relished the solitude. In our zeal to secure a place in the record books, we'd missed the equator way back in the Andes. So when we saw a sign heralding the Tropic of Capricorn, we were excessively jubilant. For 2 more days and 800 miles of uninterrupted hard riding, we followed the deserted road down the Pacific coast of Chile. We spent our last night in South America camped in the sand just beside the Pan American Highway.
South America has gone by in a flash. It's been a complete contrast to Siberia. After being reduced to 400 meters a day in Russia, we've been doing 400 miles a day thanks to the Pan American Highway. But now what I'm sure will be the best bit of the trip for me, Africa.
We arrived in South Africa on New Year's Eve. And our lineup was boosted by an old school friend, Louis Bloom, who was now the head concierge at the Cascades Hotel in Sun City, just outside Johannesburg.
When you guys asked me to join this trip, I couldn't think of anything more in the world that I really wanted to do. I couldn't resist it, and I just wanted to come. Even if you hadn't have asked me, I said, look, can I tag along?
Louis' first act of hospitality was to arrange for us to appear on South African TV.
Not many people knows about this view of Johannesburg, you know. Not many people come because it's the most magnificent view of Johannesburg.
3 Britons have been following the summer by motorbike. They're trying to make their way into the record books by covering as much of the world as they can in 300 days.
Randburg, Brixton, hey!
School teachers Austin Vince and Clive Greenhow and journalist Charles Penty left London in May in search of adventure and a world record. 50,000 kilometres later, they've reached South Africa. But it wasn't all easy riding. Many days were spent stuck in the
But because it's South Africa, the bulletin went out in Afrikaans as well.
Die laaste deel van die reis loop deur Afrika. En dit is nie 'n plek vir sissies nie. Jessica Pitchford vir TV Nuus, Johannesburg.
In fact, we were invited back to the broadcasting centre because they were so desperate for stories. It was baffling to find ourselves as guests on Good Morning South Africa.
Great excitement in the studio this morning because in everybody's heart, deep down somewhere, there's that quest for adventure. And these guys have actually did it.
No,
What is in here?
Bare essentials. Well, the worst thing that happens is you break down, you run out of petrol. Yeah, you don't problems, you get ill, but they're all problems that you cure eventually.
That must be a problem, especially in Africa. I mean, fuel stations are few and far between. And what does a tank take? About?
20 litres, 500 kilometres.
So what are you going to do?
Carry lots more gas.
Sun City is a vast entertainment complex, and there we made a base in Louis' flat, bleached our hair and prepared for our assault on the final 14,000 miles back to London. The tiny holes in our flimsy rain capes had to be carefully repaired with a latex solution. And, stingy as ever, I cannibalised an old ground sheet and fabricated 2 waterproof liners for Louis' panniers. But there was still time for us to hang out with the locals. We left Sun City and the sun behind. With 5 miles covered, we were soon able to field test the integrity of the low-budget pannier liners. We stopped in at a lion park to dry ourselves and our equipment out. Louis, who'd spent the past 3 years in Africa, accepted the dare to venture into the lion's den. But that exhausted his bravado, and he hardly moved a muscle. The fun-sized cubs were more our cup of tea.
Come with us, Juro Mundo.
And after lions, as we headed up to Zimbabwe, we found gangs of monkeys, one of which stole Clive's tyre pressure gauge. In Zimbabwe, you trade on the street, and these lads showed us how to get ahead in corn carrying. The Girder Bridge that connects Zimbabwe and Zambia is just downstream from where the mighty Zambezi crashes over a cliff at Victoria Falls. And true to form, Louis was quick to emulate the water with a freefall of his own.
Yes, this is the best one out of all of them. He's so fat, that's why it's going up and down.
Flying down was all right. It was actually when I was upside down, waiting to be escorted back up to the bridge. I looked down, facing down, and my passport carrier with all my valuables, my life.
Oh, your money belt.
Well, fortunately no money in there, but my passport was in there, Mr. Vince, don't interrupt me. So I was like, and it's hanging by a bit of cotton. Absolute godsend. Just hanging out of my t-shirt like that, and I'm looking at it swaying in the wind into the void down below, you know. Pick it up, fortunately, and give it to the gentleman that kindly roped me back up to where we're standing now.
So once Louis' not inconsiderable stomach had settled, it was back on the road. Destination, Equatorial Africa. But continuing our regime of daily physical exercise and towing whichever bike had most recently broken down. The constant torrential downpours meant that although happy to rough camp, we were grateful for any shelter that we encountered. These were the workshops of a Zambian Jesuit college, and of course, it wasn't the first time that we'd made our beds amongst the local livestock. It was easy to feel at home here, with English being widely spoken and with a cup of tea being the Zambians' first choice of social lubricant. One of the characteristics of the developing world is that sealed tarmac roads are few and far between. Consequently, the African roadside is flanked for what seems like its entire length by one ginormous village. We were by now used to the curiosity of the villagers, but whether it was the 12-volt air compressor or our ridiculous bleached hairdos that intrigued them is harder to say. The lush rainforest stretched on forever, and it was clear that the sun-baked high plains of South Africa were well behind us. In Zambia and Tanzania, we were struck by how almost everyone seems to be involved in some kind of agricultural activity, be it cattle herding or maize production in the rich soil that surrounded every village. We were attempting to set up a bivouac on the far side of this small plot, but Joseph, the owner, discovered us and insisted that we wheel the bikes into his front yard and be hosted by him and his family.
We are very happy to invite our friends from England. Thank you very much.
As we drove through the bush, daydreaming through the sights and sounds of Africa, we realised yet again how free we were. Nothing to do except ride all day and enjoy. But a wake-up call wasn't far away. In the distance, we saw a queue of traffic, but it was in fact a 10-vehicle pile-up. Around the world, we'd passed dozens of crashes, but this one we just couldn't ignore. There were many casualties, and the police told us they'd only just taken away the dead bodies. The period of mourning only lasted about 5 minutes before the locals set about channeling leaking fuel into every available container. We left this grisly scene and crossed the bridge that took us from Tanzania into Kenya. Out of the bush and back into the city. Nairobi was the 24th capital city, in which we became experts at finding our way around. Most definitely the premier metropolis in East Africa. It was a far cry from Joseph's humble mud hut. In the centre of town, we visited several embassies and consulates and secured visas for the route north to Ethiopia, Eritrea and Saudi Arabia. Lion Valley Game Reserve is practically a suburb of Nairobi. We were guided around the park by David, one of the rangers. The animals themselves weren't as aware as us that the city was so close, and they carried on their business as usual. The predators have to keep themselves upwind and hunt for their quarries as Mother Nature intended. It was strange to creep up on them while they were creeping up on someone else. Saddle saw it was a welcome change to be chauffeured in the Land Cruiser. And it was handy to have an escape vehicle if the lions decided to transfer their attention from the zebras onto the tourists. The giraffes seemed particularly graceful, but maybe they were just bored of seeing so many gawking humans. 100 miles north of Nairobi, and the tarmac's already wearing thin. And our second crossing of the equator heralded our entry into the Rift Valley. We'd heard that the equator sign is a favourite tourist destination. In some respects, the edge of Kenya's infrastructure. Beyond lay only thorn-covered desert. We were heading due north up this dusty track, through the Samburu Desert, to Ethiopia, the former Italian colony of Abyssinia. In the Second World War, the Royal Engineers bulldozed this route to take British forces from East Africa to a second front. Even in these remote areas, a small crowd gathered whenever we stopped. As far as we could tell, the track had seen no maintenance since the 1940s. For 350 nights now, we've been camping in the wild. All over the world, Mother Nature's lullaby is a chorus of barks, squeaks and gibbering. This routine of living permanently outside could seem unpleasant, but for us, the ever-changing backdrop meant that even if we could have afforded it, we would never have forsaken free camping for a 5-star hotel. The corrugated track was sending vibrations through the bikes that they were unable to sustain. So I didn't hold up the others the next day. My repairs had to be carried out by torchlight.
I've spent the last 3 years in Africa, but I've never seen anything of the place. We're camped in the bush in northern Kenya, under a fabulous starry sky, and this whole thing is totally mental. I know I did the right thing to pack in my job.
Waking up with the sun in the African bush is best enjoyed if you don't sleep in a tent. And even though we could hear lions in the distance, we never once felt any fear from wild animals. Here, we attracted the attention of a passing group of Maasai warriors, complete with togas, spears and extravagant jewellery. We traded anti-malarial drugs for some of their water. Having made the trade, we took a shortcut through the bush with disastrous consequences. Louis' alternator packed up, so we had to go back to the road and tow him to the next settlement of Marile. Kenya is a popular tourist location for the British, but we suspected that Marile had yet to be confirmed as a destination in the travel agent's brochures. The Maasai have a gritty subsistence lifestyle, and they and their families herd livestock. However, rather than rustic yokels, they're a stylish, proud and dignified people. One of whom, called Barrington, brokered a deal for Chaz with a lorry which had just pulled in for fuel and was heading north. With much aggro, we loaded Louis' bike onto the lorry, with the noisy encouragement of the crowds of people who always gather in Africa wherever there's anything to be seen. We then accompanied the lorry, with Louis and his bike on top, along the fiercely corrugated dirt road.
Hey, Charlie. What's happened here then?
I had a little bit of a skid on this pile of loose gravel here. I was looking at the map. It was in the middle of the road. This road's under construction and I didn't see it. And I came a cropper, as you can see, it landed on my face. It was scary. A little bit, you know.
So I think we can see the front rack's taking a bit of a whacking.
Going out in dust.
And how's the bike? I mean, is it...
Well, the bike started. It looks all right. There's a bit of damage to the front headlight, but it still works. The rear lamp's gone. But apart from that, these bikes just get up and keep going, don't they? So hopefully, you know, we're the same.
After several days of dry, dusty riding, the rains came and turned the road into a river. Clive went out to rescue Chaz, whose engine had stalled in the raging torrent. The undertow was so severe that Chaz simply couldn't kickstart the bike. We'd heard of flash floods. Until you've actually been in one, you can't imagine such an incredible volume of water can race over the impacted earth without being soaked up. At one stage, we really began to fear for our lives, because if anyone had toppled over into the current, it would have been all too easy to drown, trapped under your bike.
Pretty hairy back there. Chaz stalled and was stuck in there. It was so strong. It almost got swept away. Both almost got swept away.
Leaving the desert behind us, we crossed the border into Ethiopia and the high plateau surrounding the Blue Nile Gorge. In Ethiopia, we never needed a guidebook. Whenever we paused for even a moment, we were overwhelmed with suggestions of things to see and places to go. Ethiopia surprised us. We couldn't understand how a part of the world that looked like the Brecon Beacons with mud huts had become a byword for famine. North of Addis Ababa, the tarmac ran out once again. Going got slower, and we gingerly descended a vertical mile into the Blue Nile Gorge. In fact, far from the year-round drought which we'd expected, the incessant rainfall was starting to grind us down, and the soil we had assumed would be baked dry was instead a quagmire of glutinous African mud. In northern Ethiopia, the driving conditions and the liberal interpretation of the highway code became quite extraordinary.
I've just been run over. I suspect fractured ribs. We'll find out in a minute. I was just driving down on the right-hand side of the road as we do here, and this pickup was on the wrong side of the road, coming towards him. And I just sort of tried to go around him. And, you know, he moved the same way as me, and I had to let the bike down, and he just rode right over my front wheel and back wheel, right over my ribs. Everything else is okay, but my ribs are just fully.
You're off the block, Cliff, a bit, aren't you?
And this is just going to give me a new vein injection now, so.
The combination of hypodermic needles and opiate-based drugs had been intriguing customs officials all around the world. Back in London, I'd practiced my technique on a side of bacon, so I was fully qualified to inject Clive. And as the sweet, soothing painkillers penetrated his bloodstream, he, for one, was grateful that we'd brought them along. In fact, the truck's wheels had cracked 3 of Clive's ribs. We reckoned he only survived at all because the truck had deflated its tyres to cope with the rough road. If they'd been at full pressure, I think he would have been killed. And all we could give him was painkillers.
Let's just see his little ill face. There you go. All right, kids. The uneaten food.
Clive didn't manage to eat tonight.
Ah, in power-cut-stricken Ethiopia, where cuisine and home surgery is carried out with the aid of a candle only.
For several days, Clive could barely move, much less endure the journey to the telegraph office to make his fortnightly call to check in with his mum. This was his first failure to report in nearly a year. Although Clive's bike could be ridden, the crash had smashed up various fittings on the frame. But when I arrived in Gondar, the nearest town, there was no need to find an approved dealer, because our experience so far in the developing world had taught us that with almost no equipment, local ingenuity was more useful than any workshop manual. Combine this resourcefulness with Ethiopian geniality, and it's no surprise that the front rank was soldered back together in moments.
40 hours after my sandwich by a pickup truck, I am feeling better, even though I don't look that great. It's just my ribs are still very tight. The lads have been injecting me with a new bane. It sort of helped me sleep at night. And I'm slowly on the road to recovery. And that's about it. But I don't expect to be too long, and I'll be back on the plot.
Yeah.
All right. Cheers.
Over the next 6 days, a local lady helped nurse him back into shape. He was determined not to wreck our record attempt. So we installed him on a bus, put his bike on the roof, and arranged a rendezvous 300 miles further north in Eritrea, from where he would finally phone his mum. And with Clive safely taken care of, there was time to check out the bizarre sights on offer in Ethiopia that are relics of the recently concluded 30-year civil war. This bridge is only a year old. Its predecessor was dynamited by rebels, and now lies with the tank that guarded it jammed in the ravine below. More Russian Su-67s littered the countryside, all the way to Massawa, Eritrea's port on the Red Sea coast. On board the Al Rashid, a pilgrim vessel bound for Jeddah, the sea air eased Clive's convalescence, though he was still in considerable pain. Our fellow passengers helped remind us that we were returning to Islam.
Hi. If you fancy taking marijuana into Saudi Arabia, here's a warning for you.
Drugs weren't our main worry as we approached the Saudi port of Jeddah. We're down in the hold of the Al Rashid. We're just getting ready to get out and disembark at Jeddah. Mohammed, fortunately, speaks a bit of English and has been helping us out with some of the actual interpretation of the visa that we've got in Nairobi for Saudi Arabia here. It's just a transit visa, valid for 1 week. We can see that here. But, Mohammed, what does this top line mean then, in English?
Say you can pass the Qahra with the boat.
Where is Ahra?
Is the Qahra.
Cairo? Cairo in
Qahra,
Egypt?
Yeah, in Egypt.
Yeah.
And just boat.
So, do you think we can maybe try to drive to Egypt on the road through Saudi Arabia?
No, possible. Because here told you can just pass the Qahra with the boat.
So it is specific. Do you understand that word? It's
no, just I say you can pass the Qahra with the boat.
Okay.
That's it.
All right, I think we've stitched ourselves up there nicely here because I've just got the letter out here to refer to that we got the Saudi visa with in Nairobi, and we actually got the High Commissioner. You can just see there. It says they will stay for a maximum of 3 days, leaving on the first available boat to Cairo. So we were so keen to get the Jeddah visa that we asked for an exit route by which we don't actually want to go. So our plan to drive across Saudi Arabia to Jordan may well fall into disarray at this stage. We'll just see what happens when we get ashore. They can be quite strict on their regularities and their formalities, these Saudi officials. We've certainly learned from other people who've travelled this way. In fact, we slipped through customs without any trouble and spent the night, as usual, in the first abandoned shed that we could find. We were hoping that any subsequent police checkpoints wouldn't scrutinise too closely the small print of our ship-only visa. We reached Jordan and gave ourselves the luxury of a bit of sightseeing. In a sealed valley in the desert was one of the most amazing sights of the whole journey, the ancient city of Petra, which you approach through a narrow sandstone gorge called the Siq. At the end of the Siq is the treasury, the most wonderful building in the city. Hewn out of the rock, it turns from pink to deep red during the course of the day. Petra was the ancient city of the Nabateans, a nation of traders at the time of Christ, and its splendors were hidden for 1,000 years until its rediscovery by the Swiss explorer Burckhardt in the last century. Damascus, however, was a major disappointment for us.
Hello, Mondo Enduro in Damascus, oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, but sadly also the capital of a police state where video cameras are frowned upon, hence Mondo Enduro's covert filming position. Let's see what other shots we can get.
The walls to the ancient city, the great leader President Assad keeping a watchful eye on his people, the Syrian version of Petra, the Baathist vision of the future, and Clive discovering that our credit cards would not be accepted anywhere in the country. In Cappadocia, in Turkey, whilst searching for a campsite, we discovered some ancient rock dwellings. We were horrified to discover the previous tenants had not yet moved out. We weren't scared or anything, we just fancied a night under the stars. As a punishment for disturbing the spirits of the caves, Louis suffered their full vengeance in the form of a midnight bee sting. High on the central Turkish plain, we passed a man in whose presence we were humbled. Budwin Waganif was walking from Sweden to his native Cape Town in a walking prayer for peace. His aim was to free the world from money madness.
Well, how far do you actually walk in a day?
Well, I go for about 170 kilometers a week. So
A week,
I like
yeah.
to do 30, 35 is comfortable. But I've done up to 50 in a day.
There was no time to celebrate, but it was a year to the day since we last arrived in Istanbul, going in the opposite direction and with 40,000 miles ahead of us rather than behind us. For most people, the 2,200 miles from Istanbul to London would be a daunting drive. But for us, finally back in Europe, we could already taste the roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. And although our routine of living in the field continued, we could hardly believe that after 40,000 miles, we were now so close to home. On day 393, we finally confirmed that the design of mud huts is standardized around the world. But as we stared up at another set of wattle and daub walls, whose shelter had been freely afforded by a farmer in Serbia, we knew how lucky we had been to experience so much generosity and hospitality from complete strangers. And if Mondo Enduro had changed us, from now on we would have a lifetime of kindness to repay. And it was uplifting that we found human decency not just in deepest Siberia, Mexico or Tanzania, but also here in the Balkans. By now, the constant temptation to philosophize about our experiences was interrupted, either by the problems of negotiating the Budapest one-way system, or in the Czech capital, Prague, having our trillionth puncture. We were only 20 hours' ride from London, but plenty of mechanical aggravation lay in store.
So Lou, what's happened?
My clutch plates have worn away. Heavily worn away.
So what do we reckon is the solution here?
Well, I've done something just now, and God willing, I'll be able to get to Zeebrugge.
But time wasn't on our side. It was now Thursday afternoon. At 1 p.m. Saturday, a ticker-tape reception had been arranged by the headmaster back at Mill Hill School, where the whole trip had started. I raced ahead to Frankfurt to try and find some clutch plates, but I failed.
We've only got 2 days to do 700 miles. My bike's punctured. That's not the problem. I'm the rescue vehicle going to collect Louis, whose clutch plates have all burnt out, and we have to tow him the next 700 miles to Zeebrugge. Things have been better.
I eventually got back to the others, and between us, we got Louis going again. With our return deadline back at Mill Hill so close, we were incredulous that after 405 days, we'd soon be arriving somewhere that we didn't have to leave the next morning. We were indescribably excited, but as we rolled down the school drive, we were amazed by the crowd that had gathered to meet us. Over the last 14 months, we'd rarely been separated from each other or our bikes. It was absolutely extraordinary to go from such an intimate, yet insular existence, and then suddenly be thrust into a throng of our parents, friends, colleagues, and of course, loads of school kids. We'd set out to motorcycle around the Earth by the longest land route possible in the shortest possible time. And, well, we'd done it. We contacted the Guinness Book of Records the next day to see if we had established a new category. They informed us that since we hadn't formally registered with them before we left, our achievement was inadmissible. I'm still a teacher.
Well, as you can see, today we're in Quito.
Bill got married and is still a teacher. And now so is Clive. Gerald still deals with timetable inquiries at Southampton Station.
Change at Salisbury as well, and there'll be an Exeter at 4:30.
Mark became a financial strategy advisor at the BBC. Nick and Catherine were reunited in Alaska and are still together. And Louis organises conferences at a hotel outside Reading. In fact, Mondo Enduro only changed the life of one of us, and that was Chaz. Remember Clarissa from the TV shoot in Bogota? Well, Chaz certainly did. He went back, married Clarissa, and they're expecting a baby any day now. I wonder how long before it gets mine.